Hello and welcome to this DW News livestream. I'm Alex Forrest-Whiting. So we're looking at Europe beyond NATO ahead of an EU summit that's being held in Cyprus today and tomorrow. The Iran war has tested the EU's crisis planning, and there are questions, including from Cyprus itself, on how the bloc will respond if a member state is threatened. Now, we've got two great guests coming up. Our Europe correspondent, Rosie Bichard, will be joining us from Cyprus. And we're also going to have an EU and defence analyst a little bit later. So do please post your comments and your questions in the chat so I can put them to both of those guests. And first up, hopefully we can join Rosie Bichard, who is in Cyprus. There you are, Rosie. Lovely to see you. This summit is being held in Cyprus because it currently holds the bloc's rotating presidency. But there's also symbolic significance related to the Iran war, isn't there?
There really is. I'm sending you a postcard here from sunny Cyprus. This island is usually known for being a magnet for tourists, but it's also really been plunged into the spotlight as a kind of geopolitical hotspot. In the very early days of the Iran war, an Iranian-made drone hit a British base on the island, and that sparked all sort of debate here about Cyprus's history. And the Cypriot government has been at pains to stress that Cyprus itself wasn't targeted, that Cyprus is safe, that tourists are welcome here, and that they have really good relations with lots of Middle Eastern countries in this region. Let's not forget where Cyprus sits on a map. I don't know if we do have a map there, but it's really
we were just looking at a map there. Yeah. Carry on. Sorry, Rosie, because you were just explaining where exactly it sits.
Sure, yeah. It always strikes me, Cyprus, member of the European Union. The European Union capital is Brussels. It takes 4 hours to get there on a flight. But if you want to go to Beirut, for example, it only takes 45 minutes. So one person I spoke to here said, look, our geography means that we will never be able to live like an isolated little Mediterranean island. And the Republic of Cyprus government is going to be trying to flex its diplomatic muscles over the next couple of days as well. It's invited several Middle Eastern leaders from Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan to join EU leaders for talks. There are questions about whether that will be anything more than a photo opportunity, but I think Cyprus really is keen to stress that it sees itself as being something more of a broker than just a bystander in this war, which is exactly what Europe has seemed so much like so far.
Yeah, and we will talk more about Cyprus and about what that actually means for the country a little bit later on. I just want to turn now to some of the other topics that are going to be literally on the menu, perhaps even at dinner tonight, to do with this. And the first one really is Hungary and Ukraine. And I guess also this whole issue of the mutual defence within the EU. But with Hungary and Ukraine, Hungary, of course, we've had this big election and Viktor Orban, after 16 years, is on his way out. Is this something that leaders in the EU will be popping champagne corks tonight at dinner, do you think? Are they very pleased that that has now happened?
Well, Viktor Orban, interestingly, is still officially the person that would be invited to this summit. His successor, Peter Magyar, has not yet taken office, but Orban has declined to come. He is not showing up for what would have been his last EU summit, and that means the other 26 leaders can have a meeting without him. And given that he had spent much of his tenure as Hungarian Prime Minister blocking everything in the EU, from sanctions against Russia to budget decisions, whether it was delaying, watering down, all sorts of decisions, blocking foreign policy decisions. So I think there is undoubtedly a big sigh of relief from a lot of those European leaders, not least because it means the unblocking of a major €90 billion loan for Ukraine, which, let's not forget, had been agreed at the end of last year, and Kiev had been waiting patiently, saying it really needs that cash to be able not only to try and defend its territory, but also just to keep the lights on, to pay doctors, civil servants, teachers, keep its economy afloat. So I think you're going to hear a lot of European leaders feeling relieved, but also happy that they've been able to finally get this loan moving forward. Though, of course, that opens up a whole other topic of debate, right? Because how long did it take to get something agreed, which in theory had already been agreed, and now they have a whole other range of problems that they still need to deal with in their inbox?
Yeah, and I really wanted to talk to you about that 90 billion euro Ukraine loan. Just in case you were watching before, we were showing some pictures, and they were of Ayia Napa in Cyprus, and that, of course, is where this dinner is going to be held tonight. So that's why we were showing you those those pictures there. But just on that 90 billion euro loan, Rosie, what will Ukraine use it for? Because they've been wanting this money for a long time. Is it all for defence, or is it for other things as well?
It's basically trying to plug an enormous budgetary black hole that comes, Ukraine says, with trying to defend territory and fend off attacks for years now. So it's not just for defence, but it's really for things like paying civil servants and being able to keep schools running, trying to deliver basic services. Because, of course, as many Ukrainians will tell you, they have really become accustomed to life under bombardment. War has unfortunately become a daily reality of life there. The European Union has been trying to show its solidarity with Ukraine through this financing, but also to show the United States basically that it's willing to step up. We know that the US administration has been incredibly unpredictable and erratic when it comes to its support or not of Ukraine. And the European states, I think, are trying to send also a message across the Atlantic to say, look, we are playing our part here. So don't think about trying to cut a deal with Moscow that would see our security sold down the river. But of course, Trump administration remains pretty unpredictable on that front. It's, of course, now very much occupied with another war, that being the one that has been raging across the Middle East. And of course, the EU leaders are very much holding their breath with regards to that fragile ceasefire. Yeah,
and we'll talk about that in a moment. But just sticking with Ukraine, we've got Volodymyr Zelenskyy as a guest, haven't they, on Cyprus at that dinner tonight. Is that, I mean, that must be a big decision for him to go there, given, as we said, originally that Cyprus itself was hit because of that Iran war back in March, but quite a big coup, I guess, for those European leaders that he is going.
It was originally supposed to be just a kind of Zoom call. Zelenskyy regularly dials into meetings of EU leaders to brief them on the situation on the ground in Ukraine and to talk about some of these ways that the EU and Ukraine are trying to cooperate. Remember, Kyiv wants to be a member of this EU club. But the fact he's now decided to come in person, I think, is really because they want to have that moment to show the world that Europe is being able to support Ukraine, is delivering on what it promised. But of course, Ukraine will come with a bigger wish list still. It says it needs more support from the European Union, not just funds that were already agreed, but of course it always has a wish list in terms of weapons that it needs and other types of political support, given that in the past, at least, it's been a lot of fears that Ukraine might be pressured into ceding territory if the US were to kind of flip-flop, as we've seen it done over the past year or so.
Yeah, and so let's just move on to Iran, because we did just mention it there. And obviously that's a big war that's raging, and that has caused big problems for countries across the world, of course, particularly including Europe. How are they dealing with the whole issue of fuel prices rising so significantly? And is there anything that they can do about it?
That is what they're supposed to be discussing over dinner tonight. There is no doubt that the first and primary victims of this war are those that have been living under bombardment. And actually, there are quite a lot of Asian countries that have seen much more of a fallout in terms of energy prices and spikes than Europeans have. But I think what the European countries are trying to do is fend off what may be a looming crisis, particularly when it comes to jet fuel. So yesterday, the European Commission, which is the EU's executive, came out with a series of proposals, recommendations, ways that European countries could try to club together to mitigate or stave off that potential crisis. So coordinating more on jet fuel, but also relaxing some rules on state aid. So that's what money governments are allowed to give to companies without disrupting the kind of level playing field between different EU states. That's in order to try and cushion the blow of what has been really flaring energy prices. And of course, it's not just consumers that are impacted, but especially businesses. Europe has been in something of a soul-searching exercise about this buzzword we hear all the time here. It's competitiveness, because European businesses are struggling to compete with rivals in Asia and the US, and the cost of energy in Europe, not just in relation to this crisis, but a long-standing higher cost, has been seen as a key drag on Europe's ability to kind of economically stand up to the new challenges of the current world.
Yeah, I'm just looking at some of the comments that we're beginning to get in on our chat on YouTube. Hello to Duncan Stewart, also to Dan Broom. Dan Broom saying all pipelines lead to Cyprus. Duncan Stewart saying Europe importing from Iran does solve several problems. Well, at the moment, I don't think anybody is able to import from anywhere, yet alone Iran. But just picking up then on this whole issue of Iran, Rosie, how unified do you think EU countries are on Iran, and particularly on the Strait of Hormuz? So I'm thinking here particularly Germany and France.
So there is a split, but I would say they are more united in general on this war than they have been in relation to many other conflicts, especially other conflicts in the Middle East. Why? Because European states are more or less all saying, we don't want to be part of this war. They are turning down US requests to get more involved. They are trying to give the US administration and its war here a kind of wide berth. And one way we've seen them trying to do that is to come up with a so-called coalition of the willing. So countries that club together, and they are mainly coordinated by France and the UK, saying we are willing to help try and reopen and secure the Strait of Hormuz in future, but only once the situation allows for it. So when the fighting ceases. And I think in a way they're trying to sort of call the US's bluff, or show the US, look, we are willing to help. It's not that we're turning our back on you as an ally, but what we are saying is we will do it when there is peace or there's a more secure situation, because we don't want to be involved in waging this war. That being said, we have seen subtle differences between Germany and France. France particularly has been the one that's been the most strident to say no action until there is circumstances which allow us to support militarily safely.
Yeah. Very interesting there, and interesting to see what's going to happen in the next few days and weeks, of course, with this ceasefire. Let's just turn to some of the other topics, and I do want to talk about defence in a moment, but just briefly before we turn to that, the budget, because the EU is always discussing budgets. Let's talk about 2 trillion euros is what the leader, the EU officials, some of those executives would like to see. But then when it comes to European leaders, is that even a possibility? It sounds like a phenomenal amount of money, Rosie.
It sounds like a phenomenal amount of money, and what the European Commission would say is it's not that much if you compare it to budgets of different countries or how they run their own civil services. And if you look at the tasks that the EU is setting itself, so trying to rearm, to have better defences across this European Union, also trying to compete better. These are really big challenges which the European Commission says it needs money for. But member states, who are the ones, of course, that foot the bill, so member states pay into this club, and then the central coordination makes all these different decisions about how this money can be spent to benefit the Union as a whole. Member states are in no way keen on adding more budget. Why? Because their own budgets are very stretched already. Those especially who are facing elections are saying, look, I don't have any spare cash here. And that's also something that's interesting in this energy crisis. Remember back in 2022, we saw the EU trying to kind of throw some money at this, but now member states have so much less fiscal space, and they're being much more conservative in terms of what they're willing to try and chip in here. Those debates and negotiations are going to go on for years yet, and I can tell you the last time an EU budget was agreed, we were watching it for 4 days. Essentially, the leaders were almost locked in a room day and night for 4 days in a row to try and get a budget agreed. They did manage to. We may well see some sort of standoff like that down the line in future. Not, however, in Cyprus. This is going to be trying to dedicate it to just putting their heads together under the sun, getting that support to Ukraine, but of course trying to face up to some of those bigger challenges in the region and these foreign policy questions.
Yeah, I love that idea of getting their heads together under the sun. We were just looking at some of those pictures from Cyprus of where that summit is going to be held. Of course, Rosie, it's split, isn't it, between the capital and also where this dinner is going to be held tonight. So it's two different locations. Let's just pick up then on this whole issue of defence and this big topic, the sort of the elephant in the room, really, about why this has become particularly interesting and important this week. It's all focused on this EU treaty mutual defence clause from, I'm going to get technical here, Article 42.7, and I think we can possibly bring that up.
Speaking my language.
Yeah, you love this kind of stuff. We're going to bring it up, and I'm just going to read what it says, because this is very interesting. If a member state is the victim of armed aggression on its territory, the other member states shall have towards it an obligation of aid and assistance by all the means in their power, in accordance with Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Now, we will be maybe going into a little bit more detail about this with our next guest. But, Rosie, explain to me why that Article 42.7 at the moment is such a hot topic, particularly in Cyprus.
Well, it's because you might have heard much more of another article, Article 5, from NATO. So NATO is that defensive alliance, and Article 5 essentially lays out that an attack on one NATO ally is an attack on all. So that is considered a mutual defence pledge, which members hope is ironclad. But with the US being so unpredictable, signalling it wants to step back from European defence, and also really blasting Europeans for what the US says is historic underinvestment in defence. And I think actually a lot of European leaders also acknowledge that. They think they did take their eye off the ball in terms of defence for a few decades, up until really the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which was such a wake-up call. But this Article 42.7 of the EU treaties, that's much less known. That is considered as slightly less it's less tested, it's less understood, it's more kind of legal jargon in a way. It's only been invoked once, and that was by France after terrorist attacks. You should say NATO's Article 5 has also only been invoked once. That was by the US after 9/11. But the fact is we have so much more of an idea of what Article 5 might actually mean for members, because it's essentially based on the idea of deterrence. And there are structures in place of what to do if a member state comes forward, a NATO ally comes forward and says, we need help. From the EU side, with this Article 42.7, it's much less clear. And what the Cypriots actually want to do is try and get in a kind of situation room, run a scenario, say a fictional aggressor is attacking an EU member state. What's going to happen? Which EU member is ready to provide what? How are they going to have that conversation with their populations? Are there laws that are going to come in their way in terms of providing that help? So far, it's been pretty untested. And there's an addendum to the clause that you didn't actually read out, which is about not going against any member states which have particular neutrality concerns. I'm paraphrasing there, it's not exactly those words, but that is because there are several European Union countries which are not members of NATO, many of them because of their histories and several of them because they are neutral. That means they do not want to be involved in any way. They cannot be involved in sending troops to help and bail out another member state if it gets attacked. And that's why this article is so interesting, because it really raises questions for a lot of these governments at national level.
And we're just bringing up a map now, Rosie, which shows hopefully if we can see it clearly, but the countries that are that are members of the EU but are not in NATO. And we can list those, Rosie, together. It is Ireland, Austria, Cyprus, and the fourth one is Malta, I think. Malta. I think it's Malta as well. So it's those four, and that's what we're looking at the moment. So it's those four. Stay with us, Rosie, but I just want to bring in our next guest to join this conversation. She's in Kyiv at the moment, but her name is Natalie Tocci from the Institute of International Affairs, which is actually based in Rome. She is also professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And as I said, she's actually in Kyiv at the moment, so we've been having a few issues trying to connect to Kyiv. But it's great to see you, Natalie. Thank you very much for being with us. And before I ask a question, what I really wanted to do is just play you a short-ish, it's about 50 seconds long, a soundbite from the president of Cyprus. Is picking up on what Rosie was talking about why he believes the EU needs a playbook for helping with possible future attacks. Let's just listen to him, and then I'd love to get your take on it.
We have Article 42.7, and we don't know what is going to happen if a member state triggers this article. So we're going to have a discussion and prepare, let's say, an operational plan of what is going to happen in case a member state triggers this article. And there are a number of issues. You mentioned one. There are certain member states of the European Union, the majority of the member states of the European Union, that are also member states of NATO. In NATO, we have Article 5. So what is going to happen in this situation if a member state is both a NATO member state and an EU member state? What is going to happen? Which countries are going to intervene to support the neighboring countries, all countries? So we need to give substance, and that is why we're going to discuss this issue during the informal European summit in Cyprus.
And that summit is, of course, beginning this evening, lasting today and, of course, tomorrow. Natalie, I'd love to get your take on this and this real focus on this Article 42.7 and whether what he is asking for is realistic, do you think, at this summit?
Well, I mean, of course, Article 42.7 has already been triggered back in 2015 by France. Not much happened after that or as a result of that triggering. So I think it's absolutely a welcome step to talk about this issue. Also considering that in between 2015 and 2026, several things have happened, including war on the European continent, war in the Middle East, a major transatlantic rupture, and the European Union becoming itself actually more of a defence player. Of course, not the primary defence player, but a defence player. So obviously the context has fundamentally changed. And of course, there are different scenarios that are worth indeed sort of mapping out. Rosie was mentioning them earlier. What happens if a non-NATO ally, a member of the European Union like Cyprus is attacked, as of course, in fact, did happen over the course of war in the Middle East? What happens if a NATO EU member state is attacked and NATO does not come to the rescue, given the transatlantic rupture underway? What happens if a EU member state, member of NATO, is attacked by another NATO member? Just think about the whole question of Greenland, which we now pretend has disappeared, but obviously it has not disappeared at all. So I think it's an absolutely welcome initiative. Now, of course, the next question is, beyond it being a welcome initiative, does it actually have more of a prospect today to deliver something concrete compared to indeed 10 years ago? And there is where, in a sense, I become a little bit more skeptical. I get the feeling that Article 42.7 can be operationalized more rather than within a broader EU context in which everyone sits around the table, but probably more by, in a sense, coalitions of the willing, reinforced corporations within the European Union of groups of member states that are actually willing to step up to operationalize more what this article actually means.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point because, what does it really mean in practice? And you've just laid out the issues there also for NATO, a NATO state on NATO, and they're bringing up, of course, Greenland. What do you think, though, it does mean for states like Cyprus, so those states that are not part of NATO but are very much members of the European Union?
So I think what is realistic for Cyprus to expect and what is not realistic for Cyprus to expect. I think what is realistic is imagining a situation in which, indeed, if something like what happened happens again, meaning, Cyprus attacked by drones and missiles coming from Iran in this case, what would the EU automatically do, right? So what it would be prepared to do in that kind of of circumstance. There, I actually think it is realistic to imagine certain plans to be developed and eventually also to be implemented. Where I think it's far less realistic is what would, for example, the EU do if Cyprus were to be aggressed in some shape or form by its archenemy. For example, Turkey, which of course, as we know, is a NATO ally. There, I think it's far less likely that we're going to see Article 42.7 actually deliver anything concrete. It didn't in the past, very unlikely to do so in the future.
OK, I just want to hold you there a second, because we have got some comments that have been coming in from those of us who are watching this stream, particularly on YouTube, but also hello to everyone who's with us on TikTok. Duncan Stewart and Dan Broom are definitely sending quite a few comments through, not necessarily questions, but I'm just going to read this out from Duncan Stewart, particularly as you are sitting in Kyiv at the moment, Natalie. Duncan Stewart says, suddenly Russia wants to phone home as Zelenskyy gets the €90 billion assurance. Of course, that is picking up off the back of Hungary now getting out of the way for that EU loan to be given to Ukraine. And also other comments about from Dan Broom, all Middle East wars are pipeline wars. So some comments there, some of them quite sceptical as well. But just picking up then on what you were just saying about, is it, you know, would they come, what would happen to countries such as Cyprus? Is every member of the EU, in fact, in favour of the EU having a better, stronger defence pact between them?
Well, I guess as a point of principle, yes. And in fact, as a point of law, coming back to 42.7, it is a treaty that all EU member states signed up to. Now, of course, where it gets much trickier is how do we actually interpret this, which is, in a sense, precisely what this meeting is supposed to be all about. Because, of course, neutral countries are traditionally the ones that have been extremely sceptical in actually, and in fact, it would be unconstitutional for them to actually commit to a military response in the event of a triggering of Article 42.7. So I expect that if there is something meaningful that comes out of this, I expect it to be some sort of menu of different ways in which different member states may actually contribute, some in harder ways, some in softer ways, but all of which, in a sense, in some shape or form, would be showing their quote-unquote mutual assistance. This is why I come back to my earlier point. If we're actually zooming in on what the military dimension of this is, most likely that the meaningful conversation is not going to happen between 27 member states, but rather in smaller constellations of countries.
Yeah. And what would you, or how would you describe the state of EU defence at the moment? We know that countries, including where I am in Germany, have been putting billions more into their defence industries. But would you say that it has changed significantly over the past year or so?
I think at national level, absolutely, yes. I mean, beginning indeed with Germany. I mean, if you look at the trajectory of defence spending and you look at it in a time frame which is actually relatively short term, 2030, Germany by 2030 will be the third largest military spender in the world, right? So this is super meaningful. Now, where it gets far less meaningful is to what extent is this effort happening at an European Union level? And there, of course, we know, yes, indeed, there have been steps forward. The 150 billion loan package, SAFE, is certainly a meaningful one, but it's still, in a sense, tinkering at the margins, right? So the majority of the effort is happening at European national level, and it is not really happening at European Union level, which is perhaps inevitable to the extent that obviously defence is mainly a national competence, but it doesn't necessarily bode all that well for the future of European integration, given the major imbalances that it is creating. I'll just leave you with one figure. Earlier, I was talking about Germany becoming the third largest military spender by 2030. Well, by 2030, Germany will be spending double of France and the United Kingdom combined.
Wow,
Now,
that is, that's a huge figure.
Imbalance.
And you're obviously in Kyiv, as I said at the start of our discussion. How is it looking in Ukraine at the moment? Obviously, good news this week over that 90 billion euro loan that I guess will be signed off at this actual summit. But are people now feeling a bit more hopeful about where they are going with this war with Russia?
Yes, actually, I found the mood so far relatively upbeat, and I wasn't expecting it to be just as upbeat because, of course, as we know, Ukraine has just been through an absolutely devastating winter. I think the reason fundamentally for the relatively positive mood has, yes, partly to do with the 90 billion, but I think it fundamentally has to do with the awareness that actually 75, between actually 70 and 80% of Ukrainian capabilities in these wars are actually being produced in Ukraine itself. So there is this sense of whatever happens around us, we are becoming increasingly self-reliant. And even if indeed war in the Middle East has represented a short-term windfall for Russia, they actually feel that it's unlikely that Russia will, in the course of its future offensives, actually manage a breakthrough. So I feel, and actually I think this has been the case already for several months, that there is far more of a sense of, yes, we can stand with our own 2 feet. Great that the Europeans are with us, accepted the trauma of the US betrayal, and in a sense, this broader feeling of, despite that US betrayal, we will continue to stand firm.
Natalie Tocci, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it, particularly as we know that the internet connection has not been so great from Kyiv, but we really are thankful for your time because I know that you're very busy there. That's Natalie Tocci from the Institute of International Affairs, normally based in Rome, but speaking to us from Kyiv, also a professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. And also still with us is Rosie Birchard, who is DW's Europe correspondent. Rosie, number one, I think I'm saying your name incorrectly because I did have it shouted in my ear. I think I'm giving you a bit of a German stroke French surname there rather than the British stroke Scottish surname that it should be. Birchard it should be, shouldn't it?
All good.
So, I'm sorry about that.
But my 2 parents pronounce it in different ways, so don't worry.
Okay. Your line isn't great in terms of the sound, so I just want to ask you one last thing. It was interesting what we were hearing there from Natalie, and obviously ending there on Kyiv, and the fact that, as we said before, that we have Zelenskyy, who is going to be in Cyprus. He will be at this EU summit. What is the timeline of what is going to happen there over the next couple of days?
So we're starting with talks this evening on things like energy security. The Ukrainian president will be jetting in for that. And then on Friday, we'll be seeing talks between EU leaders and their Middle East counterparts. And that's the one that Cyprus has been trying to show its own clout there. And I do just want to specify quickly that everything we've said so far has been referring to the government of the Republic of Cyprus. And I just wanted to mention that this is a de facto divided island. Just a few minutes walk from here, there is a de facto checkpoint because there is something on the northern half of this island, or the northern third, which is called the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. It is not recognized internationally by anyone other than Turkey. Whereas the Republic of Cyprus, which is where I am now, is internationally recognized. And actually that history and those de facto divisions are so informative and so crucial to what Cyprus is now asking other EU states to do, which is to try and consider how they might look at collective defence in future. And of course, it is also interesting and important for Ukraine because Ukraine wants to be an EU member, and if it's hoping for a future in peace, then EU mutual defence will also be important for Kyiv.
Yeah, very good point there. Thank you so much, Rosie. Really appreciate your time. I hope that you can also enjoy some of the sunshine on Cyprus, along with those leaders who will be enjoying it. It looks glorious, but obviously on a serious note, we will look with interest to see what concrete proposals, if any, actually come out of that summit. So we will be watching this, but thank you again. And also thanks to everyone who has been dropping in your comments, particularly in our chat on YouTube. Just a couple of things. Duncan Stewart had said my petrol or gasoline has risen by 35%. Food has gone up due to diesel up by 40%. And also big thank you to Dan Broom as well, who's been putting various comments in as well, and Johannes Obers, who has also been commenting. So we appreciate that. Let me just remind you of what we have been talking about and what the top developments are for this live stream. All 27 EU leaders are set to meet in Cyprus, and on the agenda, the energy fallout from the Iran war, a new tranche of funding for Ukraine, and proposals to boost joint defence. Now, ahead of the summit, Hungary agreed to unblock 90 billion euros in funding for Ukraine, and that was after Ukraine repaired a damaged pipeline that supplies Russian oil to Hungary and to Slovakia. And Cyprus's president has called for EU members to set out clear policies for the use of the EU's mutual defence clause, known as Article 42.7. His country is one of 4 in the bloc that is not a NATO member. And the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is headed to Cyprus to speak to EU leaders to call for increased pressure on Russia to end its war against his country. So you are up to date. Thank you very much for being with us. We always appreciate it. Of course, you can always find out more from DW News by looking at our sites on all social media platforms and, of course, dw.com. That's where you'll find all the latest developments. But for now, from me, thank you very much for being here and see you next time.